The Forgotten Promise, a journey of redemption through the jungle. In the heart of the dense, untamed jungle, where the air was thick with humidity and the only sounds were the whispers of the trees and the distant calls of exotic creatures, a man named Elias stood on the edge of a path he had never dared walk before. His boots, worn from years of travel, sank slightly into the damp earth, a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he still needed to go. Elias had once been a man of promise, brilliant, ambitious, and full of hope. Years ago, he had made a vow to a close friend, Victor, who had saved his life in a harrowing expedition. The promise was simple: to return one day and fulfill a mission they had dreamed of together. It was supposed to be a journey to honor Victor's memory, to finish what they had started. But life had other plans, and Elias, overwhelmed by personal struggles and guilt, abandoned that promise without ever looking back. Time passed, and so did the sharp edges of regret, until one day the letter arrived. It was from an old friend of Victor's family, urging Elias to return to the jungle. There was something unfinished, a task left in the balance. It had been decades since Victor's death, but it felt as if his spirit had been calling out to Elias for all this time. With little more than a few belongings and the weight of the past on his shoulders, Elias made the decision to embark on a journey to fulfill the promise he had long forgotten. He didn't know what awaited him in the jungle, he only knew that he needed to seek redemption, both for himself and for the friend he had failed. The jungle was merciless. The humid air clung to his skin, and the dense foliage seemed to close in around him. Like the weight of his conscience, he trekked for days, guided by nothing but an old map and the stories of those who had passed through this wild place. Each step was a reminder of how far he had strayed from the man he had once been. Elias had changed since those days of reckless ambition. His once bright eyes were now clouded with doubt, and his heart, burdened with regret, seemed too heavy to bear. But as he pushed forward, something unexpected began to shift within him. The jungle, though harsh, offered moments of clarity, moments where the beauty of nature's resilience sparked something in him that he thought was long gone. It was as if the jungle, with all its dangers and hardships, was teaching him the lessons he had forgotten. One evening, after a long day of travel, Elias stumbled upon a clearing. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the vibrant greens and browns of the jungle. In the center of the clearing stood a stone monument, weathered by time, but unmistakable in its purpose. It was an altar, one that Victor had spoken of in their youth, where the promise had first been made. It was here that Elias realized the true weight of what he had abandoned. This was where he had failed, and now, here was the opportunity to make it right. As he stood before the altar, Elias placed a hand on the cold stone. He closed his eyes, remembering Victor's laughter, his unwavering belief in their shared dream, and the promise that had been made. The years of guilt, the weight of his inaction, all seemed to flood him at once. But in that moment, something shifted. The burden of the past began to lift, and he understood. Redemption was not about changing the past. It was about facing it, acknowledging his mistakes, and making amends in whatever way possible. The next day, Elias found what he had come for. Deep in the jungle, he discovered an ancient grove, the one Victor had described in their stories. It was a place of great significance, a place that would honor Victor's legacy. There, amidst the towering trees and whispering winds, Elias built a small memorial, a simple structure made from the wood of the jungle itself, a tribute to his fallen friend and to the promise that had once been forgotten. As he completed the memorial, Elias felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The journey had not been easy, and the redemption he sought had not come quickly, but it had come nonetheless. He had returned to the jungle not only to fulfill a forgotten promise but to rediscover himself, to reconcile with his past, and to honor the bond he had once shared with Victor. With the memorial complete, Elias stood tall, looking out over the vast expanse of the jungle that had been both a prison and a sanctuary. The journey had been long, but he had found the redemption he sought, not in the destination, but in the journey itself. And as the jungle whispered its ancient secrets around him, Elias knew that he had finally made peace with the promise he had once forgotten. The Forgotten Promise, a journey of redemption through the jungle, continued. As Elias lingered in the clearing, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of finality. It was as if the jungle itself had accepted his apology, acknowledging the pain of the past and the quiet healing of the present. But the peace that had settled within him was fleeting. For the jungle had a way of testing its visitors, and Elias knew that his journey was far from over. He lingered at the memorial, staring at the simple wooden structure he had built in Victor's honor, wondering what more he could do. He had come to understand that redemption wasn't just about grand gestures or monuments, it was about the quiet actions, the daily steps to become the person he was meant to be. But still, something tugged at him. He had fulfilled one promise, but another remained, a promise to himself. Elias spent the following days exploring the jungle deeper. With the map Victor had once drawn for him in his hands, he followed old trails, crossing streams and climbing rocky ridges, all the while listening to the jungle's symphony. With each step, the layers of guilt that had weighed on him for so long began to lift. The echoes of regret no longer haunted him as they once had, and in their place grew a sense of purpose. One morning, as Elias walked through the dense undergrowth, he heard a strange rustling sound. Turning, he saw a figure moving swiftly through the trees, a shadow, blending seamlessly into the thick foliage. He froze, his instincts sharpening. The jungle was full of life, but it was also full of dangers, and he had learned to be cautious in this wild land. The figure came into view, and Elias's breath caught in his throat. It was a young woman, dressed in worn, earth-toned clothing, carrying a bundle of supplies. Her eyes, bright and watchful, met his with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "You're not from here," she said, her voice soft but direct. Elias shook his head. "I'm looking for something, or someone, I'm not sure yet." The woman tilted her head, sizing him up. "This jungle holds many things, but it doesn't give them easily." "Perhaps it will give me what I need," Elias replied, his voice steady, but his heart was pounding. He had heard rumors of people lost in the jungle, of tribes that had lived in isolation for generations, hidden from the outside world. Had she lived here all her life? Was she part of a community he hadn't yet encountered? She studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "You're searching for redemption, aren't you?" Elias blinked, taken aback. "How did you?" "I've seen many like you," she said, a knowing smile crossing her face. "People who come here, not for adventure, not for treasure, but to make peace with themselves, to bury their pasts and move forward." Elias felt a strange connection with her, as if she had spoken the truth that he had been running from for so long. "And what if I fail? What if I'm not strong enough to leave this place behind me?" The woman's gaze softened. "The jungle doesn't judge. It lets you choose your path, but it will never forget you. The real question is, will you ever forget it?" Elias knew the answer. The jungle had become a part of him, as much as the past had. It wasn't just the promise he had fulfilled or the redemption he had found, it was about the person he had become. The man who had once been lost, broken, and consumed by regret had been transformed. The jungle had given him what he needed, not answers, but the courage to find them for himself. The woman took a step closer. "There is a place deeper in the jungle where the old spirits rest. It's said that those who truly seek redemption may find peace there, but it's not easy to reach. Are you willing to continue?" Elias didn't hesitate. "I've come this far. I'll go wherever I need to." The woman nodded, as though she had expected nothing less. "Then follow me. But remember, this is not about what you can see, it's about what you cannot." For the next several days, Elias traveled with the woman, who introduced herself as Zira. She spoke little, but her presence was reassuring. Her knowledge of the jungle was deep, she knew the paths and the places that others couldn't even imagine. Along the way, she showed him plants that healed, animals that helped guide travelers, and the sacred spaces where the jungle's spirits were said to reside. As they journeyed deeper, Elias began to understand the truth in Zira's words. It wasn't the destination that mattered, it was the journey itself, the process of facing the unknown, embracing vulnerability, and learning to trust in something greater than himself. Every step he took brought him closer to something he couldn't quite articulate, a deeper sense of peace, a spiritual understanding that transcended guilt and regret. On the seventh day, they reached a clearing. At the center stood an enormous tree, its roots sprawling outward, twisting and curling like ancient fingers reaching into the earth. It was unlike any tree Elias had ever seen. Its bark shimmered with a faint, otherworldly glow, and its branches seemed to hum with life. "This is the place," Zira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The spirits of the jungle." Elias approached the tree, feeling an overwhelming sense of awe. He could feel something beyond the physical world, the weight of time, the whispers of the past, and the weight of every decision he had ever made. As he stood there, looking up at the vastness of the tree, Elias realized that redemption wasn't something to be earned through actions or monuments. It was about acceptance, the acceptance of who he was, who he had been, and who he was becoming. With a deep breath, Elias closed his eyes. The jungle fell silent, as though it, too, was waiting for him to make peace with his past. He whispered a quiet promise to himself, one he would keep no matter what lay ahead. "I am ready," he said softly, "to forgive myself, to move forward." And as the jungle whispered in response, Elias knew that, for the first time in years, he was truly free. The Forgotten Promise, a journey of redemption through the jungle, continued. The wind picked up gently, rustling the leaves of the ancient tree. Elias stood before it, his heart heavy yet lighter than it had ever been before. The feeling of the jungle's embrace was profound, a sensation he had never thought possible. He had come here seeking redemption, but now, standing in the presence of the spirits of the jungle, he realized that he had already found something far greater, understanding. Zira stood beside him, silent as Elias absorbed the weight of the moment. There were no grand gestures, no signs from the heavens. It was just a deep, quiet knowing that he had found peace within himself. The jungle had given him what he had needed all along, not through the fulfillment of promises, but through the lessons it had taught him of patience, resilience, and acceptance. Elias opened his eyes slowly, his gaze shifting from the glowing tree to Zira. She smiled softly at him, as though she knew exactly what he was feeling, though words were no longer necessary. "You found it, haven't you?" Zira asked, her voice a mere whisper in the stillness of the jungle. Elias nodded. "I've found the place I was always meant to reach. It wasn't about Victor or the promise I made. It was about understanding that redemption isn't something I have to earn. It's something I need to allow myself." Zira's eyes shone with a quiet approval. The jungle has a way of showing us truths we often ignore. It is not a place of punishment, but of transformation. You have walked its path, faced your past, and now you walk in peace. But remember, Elias, the jungle doesn't release you all at once. It will always be with you, just as the memories of what you've learned here will be with you. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle inside him. "I understand. The journey never really ends. It's just different now." "Yes," Zira said. "Now, you are free to walk forward without the burden of the past." Elias turned toward the path that lay ahead, feeling a mixture of reluctance and eagerness. He had come to the jungle seeking closure, but what he had found was a new beginning. He felt the pull to continue exploring, to walk beyond the boundaries of what he had known, to see where this new understanding could take him. Yet, there was no urgency now, no desperate need to prove anything to anyone, not even to himself. "I think it's time for me to leave," Elias said, more to himself than to Zira. "Then you must," she replied, her voice calm and certain. "But remember this, the jungle does not forget. Once you've been touched by it, you are always a part of it." Elias looked around one last time, taking in the vastness of the jungle that had become both a sanctuary and a teacher. The paths ahead were still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to walk them, no longer weighed down by the past. He was prepared to embrace whatever came next. Zira nodded to him once more before stepping back into the shadow of the trees. "Take what you've learned here, let it guide you, wherever you may go." With that, Elias turned and began his descent from the clearing. The jungle, as alive and vibrant as ever, seemed to part before him, no longer a daunting maze of obstacles, but a companion in his journey forward. Days passed as Elias made his way out of the jungle, each step feeling lighter than the last. The dense foliage gradually gave way to more familiar terrain, and the deep green of the jungle turned to open skies and rolling hills. By the time he reached the edge of the jungle, Elias could see the distant horizon stretching wide before him, filled with infinite possibilities. As he stepped onto the path leading back to the village, he realized that the redemption he had sought wasn't just about fulfilling a forgotten promise, it was about reconnecting with himself and the world around him. The jungle had shown him that, despite his flaws and mistakes, he was still worthy of peace. The lessons he had learned were not just for him to carry, but for him to share, to spread forward in the hopes that others might find their own paths to healing. When Elias finally returned to the village, he was no longer the man who had left. He was no longer burdened by regret or haunted by the past. He had found redemption, not through grand acts or heroic deeds, but through the quiet courage of accepting his imperfections and letting go of the guilt that had weighed him down for so long. The people of the village greeted him with a mix of surprise and curiosity, but Elias didn't have to say much. His eyes, the same eyes that had once been clouded with doubt, now shone with a calm understanding. He had returned, but not as the man he had been. He had come back as someone new, someone who had learned that true peace comes from within. And so, the journey continued. Elias knew there were still challenges ahead, still mistakes to be made, and still roads to travel. But he also knew that he no longer feared the unknown. The jungle had taught him that redemption was not a destination, but a journey that would continue for as long as he walked, with every step taken in peace and understanding. The forgotten promise had been kept, but more importantly, Elias had found the most precious gift of all, the ability to forgive himself, to walk forward with a heart free from the chains of his past. The forgotten promise, a journey of redemption through the jungle, continued. Months passed since Elias returned to the village. The sun, now warmer and brighter, cast long shadows over the fields where he worked. Life had become simpler in many ways, yet each day he walked with a newfound awareness, an understanding that the jungle had not only given him redemption but had also provided him with a deep connection to the world beyond the village. Though the weight of regret had lifted, Elias wasn't naive enough to believe that his journey was truly over. He had learned that peace, like the jungle, was a living, breathing thing. It required tending, nurturing, and constant attention. And while he had found a sense of fulfillment, he knew the lessons of the jungle would forever shape the way he viewed the world and the people in it. One evening, while sitting by the fire outside his small cottage, Elias was approached by an older woman from the village, Mara, a kind-hearted and insightful woman who had lived in the village for as long as anyone could remember. She sat beside him, her presence quiet but filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. "You seem different," she said, her weathered hands carefully arranging the firewood. "The way you look at the world, it's as though you've seen something that most people never will." Elias nodded, grateful for her perceptiveness. "I've seen the jungle, Mara, not just the trees and animals, but the truth of it, the lessons hidden within it, the people, the mistakes, the pain, all of it is part of the journey. And I learned that no matter how far you go or how hard you try to escape, you can't run from who you are." Mara smiled softly, her eyes distant, as if recalling a memory long buried. "The jungle teaches us, Elias, not through words or guidance, but by making us face the things we don't want to see, and in the end, we either embrace those things or let them destroy us." Elias was silent for a long moment, the crackling of the fire filling the stillness. "I think I've finally learned to embrace them." She looked at him then, her gaze soft and knowing. "Good. You may have returned to the village, but the journey you've taken has changed you. You can't go back to being the man you once were, and that's a gift." "I've learned," Elias said, his voice quiet but certain, "that redemption isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about learning from them. It's about forgiving yourself and finding the courage to move forward." Mara nodded, her expression proud but weary. "Then you are ready. Ready for what the world has in store for you next. There are always new challenges, new lessons to learn. The jungle doesn't end just because you've left it. It will find you again, in ways you least expect." Elias smiled, a weight he didn't know he'd been carrying lifting from his chest. "I think I'm ready for whatever comes next." As the days turned to weeks, and the rhythm of village life resumed, Elias found himself thinking often of the jungle. It remained a part of him, its lessons etched into his soul, but he no longer felt the pull of guilt or regret. Instead, there was a quiet sense of responsibility, a desire to share what he had learned, to help others find their own paths to healing, to guide them when they found themselves lost in their own jungles. One afternoon, a traveler arrived in the village, a young man with a weary expression and eyes that held the same weight Elias had carried for so many years. The traveler was searching for something, though he couldn't say exactly what. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt, and the desperate search for answers was clear in his eyes. Elias watched him from a distance for a few days before finally approaching. He knew that look all too well, the look of someone running from their past, desperately seeking something. Anything to fill the void. You look like you've been through a great deal, Elias said one evening as he sat beside the young man by the village well. The traveler, startled at first, seemed to relax upon hearing the gentleness in Elias's voice. I don't know what I'm looking for. I've made mistakes, too many to count, and now I don't know how to fix things. Elias nodded knowingly, his own memories of guilt and regret stirring in his chest. I understand, he said softly. I was once like you, lost, feeling as though there was no way out of the things I'd done. But I learned that sometimes the journey we think we need to take isn't the one we're meant for. Sometimes the answers lie within us, if we're willing to face what we've hidden. The young man looked at him with a mixture of doubt and curiosity. And how did you find peace? Elias smiled, his thoughts drifting to the jungle, to Zira, to the ancient tree that had witnessed his transformation. I went into the jungle, he said, his voice steady, not seeking an end, but a beginning. I learned that redemption isn't a destination. It's a way of living. It's about accepting your mistakes, not as chains, but as lessons. The jungle taught me that, and it can teach you, too. The traveler sat in silence, absorbing Elias's words. For a long while, neither of them spoke. But in that silence, something shifted. The weight of the young man's burden seemed to lighten, just slightly. I don't know if I'm ready to go into the jungle, the young man finally said, his voice tentative. But maybe I'm ready to try. Elias placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't have to go alone, and you don't have to go right away. But when you're ready, the jungle will be there. And when you're ready, it will show you the way. The traveler nodded slowly, a small spark of hope igniting within him. Elias knew the road ahead for this young man would be long and filled with its own trials. But he also knew that the jungle, whether physically or metaphorically, would always be there, waiting to offer its lessons, just as it had for him. As the sun began to set over the village, Elias stood and gazed out across the horizon. The jungle, with all its mysteries and truths, felt closer than ever. The journey never truly ended. It simply evolved, unfolding in ways he couldn't yet understand. And with that, Elias understood something else. The jungle had given him its final lesson. The path of redemption wasn't just about facing the past. It was about helping others find their own way, guiding them when they were lost, and sharing the peace he had found with those who needed it most. And so, Elias continued, no longer a man running from his past, but a guide for others, walking with them through their own jungles, one step at a time. The Forgotten Promise, a journey of redemption through the jungle, continued. As the seasons changed, Elias found himself becoming a quiet fixture in the village. His presence was no longer that of the man who had arrived haunted by guilt. Now, he was someone others sought out, not just for his wisdom, but for his calm, steady presence. The villagers began to recognize that Elias had become something of a bridge between their world and the mysteries of the jungle. The young traveler, whose name was Luca, returned to the village after several weeks of quiet reflection. His time in the jungle had been transformative, though in ways he hadn't fully understood. He still struggled with the past, still wrestled with his guilt and the mistakes he'd made. But there was a quiet strength in his eyes now, an acknowledgement that the road ahead, though uncertain, was his to walk, and he had a guide now. Elias met him by the village's edge one morning, the rising sun casting long shadows across the fields. How did it go? Elias asked gently, sensing the change in Luca, though the young man's expression was still mixed with uncertainty. It's hard to explain, Luca admitted, running a hand through his hair. I didn't find the answers I thought I would, but I found something else, something better. Maybe, I don't know, but I'm not as lost as I was before. Elias smiled, a deep sense of pride swelling in his chest. That's the beginning. The answers aren't always what we expect. Sometimes, the real lesson is in the space between questions. Luca looked at him, his expression softening. I think I understand what you meant now, Elias. About the journey not being a destination. It's not about solving everything at once. It's about learning to walk with it, to live with it. Elias nodded, his gaze turning toward the distant hills. The jungle doesn't give you everything at once. It lets you grow. It shows you the way. But you still have to take the steps. You've taken the first one, Luca. Now you need to keep walking, even when it's unclear. For the first time, Luca met Elias's eyes with true understanding. I'm not running anymore. No, Elias replied, his voice firm with quiet wisdom. You're facing what you've run from, and that, my friend, is the beginning of something beautiful. The days that followed saw Luca spending more time in the village, learning from Elias, assisting with tasks, and reflecting on his own journey. He would occasionally head back into the jungle for short periods, but always with Elias's advice in his mind, an internal compass guiding him through the thick of it. Little by little, he started sharing his experiences with the other villagers, opening up about the struggles he had faced and the lessons he had learned. It was as if a ripple had been set in motion, a wave of healing spreading outward from one person to the next. Elias, though no longer a man driven by his own need for redemption, found peace in guiding Luca, and in the process, he began to see how the threads of his own journey had intertwined with those of others. His role as a guide had become more than a way to find solace. It had become a way to give back, to help others make their own peace with the shadows they carried. One evening, after a long day of work in the village fields, Mara approached Elias as he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Her familiar presence beside him brought comfort, as always. You've changed a lot, she remarked, her tone as gentle and wise as ever. I remember when you first came here, I could see the weight on you, and now you're the one giving others hope. Elias chuckled softly, shaking his head. I don't know about giving hope. I'm just walking beside them, showing them that it's okay to stumble. We all do. But what matters is getting back up and continuing. Mara's smile was warm, and there was a glint of pride in her eyes. It's a gift you've found, Elias, not just for yourself, but for all of us. Elias looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. I think the real gift is learning to be present. The jungle teaches you that. You can't rush the healing. It takes time, but each moment is valuable, even the difficult ones. You've learned well, Mara said, her voice soft. And you're right. It's not just about the destination. It's about who you become along the way. Elias sat in silence, the crackling of the fire filling the quiet night. His thoughts drifted back to the jungle, to the lessons it had taught him, and to the many people he had met along the way. He realized then that while the jungle had shaped him, it wasn't the jungle itself that had made him whole, it was the journey, the act of confronting his past, and the willingness to grow. It had taught him that there was no need to hide from his mistakes, no need to run from his fears. With the village now peaceful and the people finding their own paths to healing, Elias felt a deeper connection to the world around him. He wasn't the same man who had arrived broken, seeking redemption. He had found it, and in doing so, had unlocked something more profound, the ability to live without the burden of guilt, and the willingness to help others do the same. And just as the jungle had continued to grow and evolve, so too did the journey of redemption. One morning, after a quiet night of rain, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the jungle once more. The path before him was familiar yet filled with new mystery. The call of the wild still echoed in his heart, but this time, it wasn't an escape. It was a return. Not for redemption, not to fulfill promises left behind, but to see the jungle with new eyes, to embrace the lessons it still had to offer. And as Elias stepped forward into the embrace of the jungle once again, he realized something profound. The journey was not just about finding redemption, it was about embracing life fully, with all its complexities, and walking forward with a heart open to every new experience. The jungle had shown him the way, but it was up to him to keep walking. The Forgotten Promise, a journey of redemption through the jungle, continued. Elias took a deep breath as he stepped once again into the jungle, his feet sinking softly into the moist earth. The air was thick with the scent of rain, and the mist that clung to the trees wrapped around him like an old, familiar cloak. The jungle had always felt alive to him, but now, it seemed more like a living being than ever before. Each rustling leaf, each distant call of the animals, spoke to him of the changes he had gone through and the changes still ahead. The path was clearer than he remembered. In the past, the jungle had felt like a maze, a place of confusion and uncertainty. But now, after everything he had learned, the path seemed less daunting. Each step forward felt grounded, as if the very earth beneath his feet recognized the man he had become. The past few months had been a slow unfolding of understanding, and now he was here, standing at the edge of the familiar, ready to dive deeper into what was left to learn. Elias had no set destination, no plan. This wasn't about seeking answers. This was about continuing the journey, about moving forward with the lessons he had already learned and trusting that the jungle would reveal what was needed, when it was needed. As he walked, his thoughts turned to the people he had left behind in the village, Luca, Mara, the other villagers who had come to him for guidance. They were all at different points in their own journeys, and Elias felt a deep sense of gratitude that he had been a part of their lives. It wasn't always easy to walk with someone through their struggle, but he had learned that sometimes the most important thing was simply being there. Sometimes, people just needed someone to walk beside them until they could stand on their own. Elias continued walking, moving deeper into the heart of the jungle. The trees grew taller here, their thick trunks reaching upward, as though trying to touch the sky. The sunlight, filtered through layers of dense leaves, cast an ethereal glow across the forest floor. Every step he took was cushioned by the earth. Every breath he drew felt more connected to the natural world around him. He could hear the faint sounds of birds and insects, but it was the deep, almost rhythmic hum of the jungle that filled his senses. It was then that he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Up ahead, standing like a sentinel, was a massive tree unlike any he had encountered before. Its bark was a deep, dark brown, twisted and gnarled, and its roots seemed to stretch out like veins beneath the earth, forming intricate patterns on the ground. The branches above were thick with vines, but there was something about this tree that drew him in. Elias moved closer, feeling a strange pull as he approached. He had seen many trees during his time in the jungle, but this one felt different. It was as though it had been waiting for him, as though it held a secret he had yet to uncover. When he reached the base of the tree, he paused. There, nestled between the roots, was a small stone. It was smooth and worn by time, and as Elias reached down to pick it up, he felt a surge of recognition. The stone felt familiar, as though he had held it before, though he had no memory of it. He held the stone in his palm, turning it over. Etched into its surface was a symbol, one that he recognized immediately. It was the same symbol that had appeared in his dreams all those years ago, the same one that had haunted him in the days before he set foot in the jungle. For a moment, Elias simply stared at it, his mind racing. This was it. This was the answer he had been searching for, though not in the way he had expected. The symbol was not a key to a forgotten promise. It wasn't a sign that he needed to fulfill some great destiny. Instead, it was a reminder of who he had been, who he had become, and the journey that had brought him to this moment. He closed his hand around the stone, feeling its warmth. The jungle had never been about answers, it had always been about growth. And now, standing at the foot of this ancient tree, Elias understood that the journey was never truly about reaching a destination. It was about continuing to move forward, to learn, and to be present in each moment. With the stone in his hand, Elias took a deep breath and looked up at the towering tree above him. The jungle had given him everything he needed, not through grand revelations, but through quiet, steady moments that had transformed him from the inside out. And now, it was showing him that the journey was far from over. He turned away from the tree, his footsteps sure as he made his way back toward the path that would lead him home. The jungle had no end, no conclusion. It was a place of endless discovery, a place where every step was an invitation to learn, to grow, and to embrace life fully. As he made his way out of the jungle, Elias knew one thing for certain: he was no longer the man who had entered it. He had become something else, something more. The journey of redemption had not been about fulfilling a promise or escaping the past, it had been about accepting the fullness of who he was, flaws and all. It had been about embracing life as it came, and walking forward with an open heart. And so, as Elias emerged from the jungle and into the familiar world of the village, he carried with him not only the stone but the knowledge that his journey was ongoing. The jungle would always be a part of him, but it was only one chapter of a much larger story. The next chapter was waiting, and he was ready to face it, knowing that whatever came next, he would meet it with the same strength, grace, and acceptance that the jungle had taught him. The forgotten promise had been kept, but redemption, Elias realized, was not a singular event, it was a continuous journey, one that could never truly end.